The moment the names Sean, Diddy, Combs, and Suge Knight started appearing together again in conversations about Tupac Shakur, something unusual began happening online. People who thought this story had already been solved years ago suddenly started asking the same question again. What if the truth was never actually finished? Because new discussions, old interviews, and long-ignored documents have started circulating again, and together they paint a picture that many people say looks very different from the story the public was told. For decades, the narrative around Tupac's death has remained surrounded by mystery. The night itself is known. The location is known. The car, the street, the people who were there. But the deeper question why it happened and who truly wanted it to happen has never completely stopped being debated. And now, as more attention returns to the case, two names continue appearing again and again. Diddy and Suge Knight, two of the most powerful figures in hip-hop during the same era Tupac was dominating the music industry. Two men connected to rival empires, and two men whose relationships with Tupac were far more complicated than many fans realized at the time. Because if you go back to the final period of Tupac's life, the tension around him wasn't just coming from one direction. It was coming from everywhere. The music industry was changing fast. Record labels were fighting for dominance. Artists were becoming symbols of entire movements. And Tupac had become something much bigger than just a rapper. He was influence. He was attention. He was power. And in an industry where reputation and loyalty could change overnight, that kind of power could also make someone extremely dangerous to the people around him. What makes this story even more fascinating is that many of the clues people are discussing today were actually said publicly years ago. Interviews, statements, stories that didn't seem important at the time. But when you place them together, they begin forming a pattern that some investigators believe raises uncomfortable questions about the people closest to Tupac. One of the biggest questions revolves around something surprisingly simple. Protection. At the height of Tupac's fame, with tensions already rising in the music industry, many people later wondered why certain security precautions were never taken. Why someone so important could still move through public places with limited protection. Why certain situations were allowed to escalate. And why, according to some critics, the environment around him was becoming more dangerous rather than safer. Those questions eventually started pointing toward the man who controlled the label Tupac had joined during the final stage of his career. Suge Knight. At the time, Suge Knight was one of the most powerful figures in hip-hop. He ran a label that dominated the charts and carried enormous influence inside the industry. For many artists, signing with him meant instant visibility and massive success. But it also meant becoming part of a world where loyalty and rivalry were constantly colliding. Some people who later looked back at the situation said Tupac may have trusted Suge more than he should have. Not because Suge appeared hostile toward him, but because Tupac reportedly began seeing him as something more than a business partner. Almost like a protector. And according to some voices that later spoke about the situation, that level of trust may have been dangerous in an industry filled with hidden conflicts. At the same time, another name continued appearing whenever conversations turned toward rivalries during that era. Sean Diddy Combs, the founder of another powerful label that represented artists on the opposite side of the industry's biggest feud. For years, fans believed the tension between Tupac and Diddy was simply part of the famous East Coast versus West Coast rivalry that defined that era of hip-hop. But as more stories began resurfacing over time, some people started wondering if the situation was deeper than music competition. Because multiple interviews suggested there may have been personal tensions growing behind the scenes long before the night everything changed. Some accounts even suggested that certain relationships inside the industry were becoming extremely complicated. Artists interacting with people connected to rival labels. Friendships shifting. Alliances becoming unclear. And in a world where reputation could mean everything, even small personal conflicts could escalate into something far more serious. That's where things begin to get even more interesting. Because over the years, several people who were close to the situation have shared statements that continue fueling speculation about what was really happening behind the scenes. Some claim there were warnings that tensions were escalating. Others say certain people may have known Tupac was becoming a target long before the public realized anything was wrong. And when those comments started resurfacing again recently, fans began revisiting interviews that had almost been forgotten. Interviews where people described the environment around Tupac during his final days. An environment filled with pressure, loyalty tests, and powerful figures whose interests didn't always align. Which leads to a question many viewers have started asking again after hearing these stories circulate. If so many warning signs were appearing around Tupac, why did nobody stop what was coming? Let me know what you think in the comments. Because the deeper you go into this story, the more complicated it becomes. And once investigators began revisiting the events surrounding that night, they started looking closely at the people who had the most influence over the situation. Not just the people who were present when it happened, but the people whose decisions may have shaped everything leading up to it. And that's when attention started turning toward a name that would later become one of the most controversial figures connected to the entire investigation. A man whose own statements over the years have kept the debate alive, and whose version of events would eventually introduce a completely new layer to the mystery surrounding Tupac's final moments. Because according to some accounts, the story may not begin on the night of the incident at all. It may begin much earlier, when the rivalry between powerful figures inside the music industry started reaching a breaking point. As investigators and journalists began looking deeper into the story, the conversation slowly shifted away from just the night everything happened. Because many people started realizing that if something like that could occur in the middle of a busy city, surrounded by witnesses and cameras, then the real story might not begin on that street at all. It might begin months earlier, possibly even years earlier. The deeper analysts went into the history of that time period, the more they noticed how intense the environment around Tupac had become. The music industry wasn't just competitive. It was divided. Two powerful labels were dominating headlines, each representing different coasts, different artists, and different loyalties. On one side stood Suge Knight, whose label had built an empire on the West Coast with artists who were dominating the charts. On the other side stood Diddy Suge, who had quickly turned his own label into a powerful force representing the East Coast sound. At first, the rivalry between the labels looked like marketing. Fans saw it as competition. Artists used it to create energy in their music. But behind the scenes, several insiders later suggested that the tension between these circles had begun turning personal. Very personal. Some interviews described moments where friendships between artists began collapsing. Others mentioned conversations that hinted certain figures in the industry were starting to see each other not just as competitors, but as obstacles. And Tupac had become one of the most visible figures in that entire conflict. He wasn't just releasing music. He was speaking openly. He was addressing rival artists directly. He was turning interviews into statements that millions of people were watching, which meant every move he made was being noticed. Every comment he made carried weight. And in an environment where reputation mattered more than anything, words could sometimes escalate situations faster than anyone expected. This is where another name began appearing more frequently in conversations surrounding the case. A man who spent years speaking publicly about what he claimed to know about that night. A man whose own statements would later attract the attention of investigators. Keefe. For a long time, his name existed on the edges of the story. People who followed the case closely knew who he was. But the wider public didn't pay much attention to his interviews. That changed when clips from those interviews began circulating again. Because in several of those conversations, Keefe described moments that investigators later considered extremely important. He talked about the environment at the time. He talked about the people involved. And he talked about the possibility that the events of that night may have been connected to something much bigger than a spontaneous confrontation. According to those discussions, certain rivalries inside the industry had become extremely tense. Not just between artists, but between the powerful figures controlling the labels themselves. And if those rivalries were influencing decisions behind the scenes, it meant the motivations behind the incident could be far more complex than originally believed. Some people who revisited these statements began pointing out another detail that had always been difficult to explain: the speed at which everything unfolded, the sequence of events that led from an earlier confrontation to the final moments later that night, and the fact that certain individuals seemed to know exactly where Tupac would be moving throughout the evening. That detail alone sparked enormous debate, because if someone had that level of information about Tupac's movements, it raised questions about how that information traveled through the circles surrounding him. Some analysts believe the environment around the music industry at the time made it easier for information to spread quickly. Artists traveled with entourages. Events were public. Nightlife locations were known. And once someone famous arrived somewhere, it didn't take long before people around the city knew. But critics of that explanation argue something else. They believe the situation may have involved individuals who already had access to insider knowledge. People connected to the music industry. People familiar with the routines of artists and their teams. That possibility is one reason the names Diddy and Suge Knight continue appearing in conversations about the case. Because both men were not only powerful figures in the industry, they also had enormous influence over the artists and networks surrounding them. Suge Knight controlled the label Tupac had joined during the final stage of his career, a label that had built its reputation on dominance in the rap industry. Meanwhile, Diddy was running another powerful label that represented some of the most famous artists on the opposite side of the rivalry. The tension between those two camps had already been widely discussed in interviews during that era. But when investigators began revisiting the situation years later, some people believed the rivalry might have been more complicated than anyone realized at the time. Because in several interviews, artists from both sides later admitted something interesting. Before the rivalry became public, many of them had actually been friends. They had worked together. They had appeared in the same places. Some had even spoken positively about each other's music, which made the rapid escalation of tensions even more surprising. Something had clearly changed. And once those tensions exploded publicly, the industry found itself watching one of the most intense rivalries hip-hop had ever seen. In the middle of that rivalry stood Tupac. Charismatic, outspoken, unfiltered, he had become a symbol of loyalty to one side of the conflict. But that also meant he had become one of the most visible targets in the entire industry. Some analysts later suggested that Tupac's personality played a role in escalating the situation. Not because he intended harm, but because he refused to stay silent. When he believed someone had wronged him, he spoke about it openly. When he believed there was betrayal, he addressed it directly. And when millions of fans are listening to every word, those statements can travel very far. Especially in an industry where pride and reputation often carry enormous weight. By the time investigators began reconstructing the chain of events leading up to that night, they realized something else. Several confrontations had already taken place before the final incident. Arguments, tensions between groups, moments where the environment around Tupac had become extremely volatile. Which means the final moments that night may not have been a sudden event. They may have been the final link in a chain of escalating situations that had been building for a long time. And if that chain truly stretched back through rivalries, alliances, and powerful industry figures, then the mystery surrounding Tupac's passing might involve far more people than originally believed. That possibility is exactly why the discussion has never disappeared. Every few years, new interviews surface. Old statements reappear. Fans begin revisiting details that once seemed unimportant. And once those pieces are placed together again, the same question returns. Was the truth behind Tupac's story ever fully revealed? Or are there still powerful chapters of that story that the public has only begun to understand? Because the deeper investigators looked into the events surrounding Tupac's final hours, the more they realized something unsettling. Some of the most revealing details may not come from what happened that night. They may come from what happened immediately afterward. In the hours and days that followed the incident, the entire music industry seemed to freeze. News traveled quickly. Fans around the world were shocked. And for a moment, it felt like everyone was asking the same question. How could something like this happen to one of the biggest stars in the world? But while the public focused on the tragedy itself, investigators quietly began piecing together everything that had happened before and after that night. Every witness, every movement, every connection between the people who had been present in the city that evening. At first, the case appeared to move slowly. Information was scattered. Stories didn't always match. And the environment surrounding the music industry during that time made the investigation extremely complicated. Because many of the people connected to the situation weren't ordinary witnesses. They were powerful figures with influence, reputations, and entire careers connected to the events unfolding in the public eye. One of the details investigators examined carefully was the confrontation that had taken place earlier that evening. The moment inside the casino that many people now believe triggered the chain of events that followed. Security footage later confirmed that Tupac had been involved in a physical altercation with someone who had a reputation connected to street circles. To many observers, that confrontation seemed like the spark that ignited everything else. But some analysts argue that the tension surrounding Tupac was already building long before that moment. They believe the altercation simply accelerated a situation that was already extremely volatile. Because once the incident inside the casino occurred, the atmosphere around Tupac changed immediately. People who had been present that night later described the energy shifting very quickly. Groups moving through the same spaces. Eyes watching. Conversations happening quietly in corners. The type of environment where small conflicts can suddenly grow into something far more dangerous. And as Tupac and the people around him continued moving through the city later that night, the sequence of events eventually led to the moment that has been replayed in documentaries, interviews, and investigations for decades. The moment when two vehicles stopped beside each other. The moment when seconds changed the course of hip-hop history. But what happened after those moments may be just as important as the incident itself. Because once the news spread, investigators began searching for the people who might have been responsible. And that search eventually led to several individuals who had been connected to the earlier confrontation. Over time, statements from those individuals began surfacing in interviews and discussions about the case. Some of those statements described the environment surrounding the rivalry at the time. Others described how quickly tensions between different groups could escalate. But one thing that continued drawing attention was the possibility that the situation had involved more planning than originally believed. That possibility is why certain interviews given years later attracted so much attention. Especially interviews where individuals connected to the case described conversations that allegedly happened behind the scenes. Some of those claims suggested that powerful figures inside the music industry may have been aware of the hostility surrounding Tupac. Others claimed that certain rivalries had become so intense that retaliation between circles of influence had started becoming expected. Those claims have never been universally accepted. Many people still believe the situation was the result of a street conflict that spiraled out of control. But others believe the story is more complicated. Because the more investigators revisited the case, the more connections they found between people who were present in the industry during that era. Artists, managers, label executives, associates, all part of a network where information moved quickly and alliances shifted constantly. And when discussions returned to the biggest names connected to that network, two figures continued appearing in those conversations. Diddy and Suge Knight. Both men represented powerful empires during the height of hip-hop's most intense rivalry. Both were surrounded by loyal teams and influential artists. And both had relationships with Tupac that have been debated for decades. Some analysts believe those relationships were simply part of the larger industry competition. Others believe the dynamics between those circles may have created an environment where conflicts could escalate faster than anyone expected. Even today, decades later, new interviews and discussions continue to revisit those connections. Fans examine old footage. Journalists review past statements. Investigators look again at details that once seemed insignificant. And each time the story resurfaces, the same debate begins all over again. Was Tupac's story simply the tragic result of a rivalry that spiraled out of control? Or were there deeper forces inside the music industry, influencing the events that unfolded? The truth may never be completely clear, because the people who lived through that era all remember it differently. Some speak openly about what they witnessed. Others remain silent, and some stories may never fully reach the public. What remains undeniable, however, is the impact Tupac left behind. His music, his voice, his influence on an entire generation of artists and fans. Even today, his legacy continues shaping conversations about hip-hop, culture, and the power of music. And perhaps that is why the story surrounding his life and passing continues to captivate people around the world. Because every time new discussions appear, they remind audiences of how powerful that moment in history truly was. A moment that still raises questions, a moment that still inspires investigation, and a moment that continues to keep Tupac's legacy alive in the minds of millions. If you found this breakdown interesting and want to see more deep stories like this, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next video.